Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome. We are really happy you were able to make it today. So we have a really important speaker and a really important event who is talking about a very timely topic. So first of all, I want to welcome Maryn McKenna to our campus and to the Husband School. I know that this event is co-sponsored by 4 different organizations, and Tom Linden will talk a little bit about that. But I want to officially welcome all of you, especially Maryn, to our building and UNC and our school, the Husband School. Thank you for being here. And of course, because we are so proud of our school and UNC, we want to share that with you. And I have a little welcome gift for you. We can leave it here for now, but
my favorite color.
Oh, there we go. Carolina blue. There we go. So thank you for being here. Welcome. And Tom Linden will introduce you officially. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Dean West. I'm Tom Linden. I'm a professor of medical journalism at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School, Husband School, Journalism and Media. And it's my pleasure today to present the speaker for the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, Kavli lecture on science journalism. And lecturer is Maryn McKenna. Maryn is the author of several books, including Superbug, Methicillin Resistant Staphylococcus aureus, and more recently, Big Chicken, the incredible story of how antibiotics created modern agriculture and changed the way the world eats. She's also a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, New Republic, Wired, where she's a senior writer, Smithsonian, The Atlantic, National Public Radio, Scientific American, Nature, The Guardian. You get the idea. She's widely published, very well respected in the science journalism field. In fact, she won the Victor Cohn Prize for science, medical science writing this year, 1 recipient per year. And it's a lifetime achievement award. So we're very honored to have her here. And I should add that she spent 10 years at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution as the only U.S. journalist assigned to full-time coverage of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And she'll be talking about mis and disinformation as it applies to COVID and repercussions of that. So welcome, Maryn. Really pleased to have you here with us.
We're going to do a little check. I hope that works for the watching audience. Thank you, John. Thank you all for coming, actually, like in person. I teach at Emory, and I discovered how hard it is to actually get people to show up for something as opposed to watching something on the screen. So I'm very touched that you all came. Thank you. And thanks, Tom, the Husband School of Journalism and Media. Thanks, Dean Nancy Fournier, and the Gilling School of Global Public Health, and to the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Kavli Foundation, first for honoring me with the AAAS Kavli Award for magazine writing, which was for work I did in the New Republic a couple of years ago, predicting national politics would harm public health, and now for asking me to speak on communication and public health. So I want to say first that I know I can see that you're in this room, but also probably online as well. There are undergraduates and graduate students, faculty, and interested community members who probably know something about my own field of journalism and my allied field of public health. This is the point at which I should say that I am half an epidemiologist. I managed the first year of coursework and then the money ran out. So I don't expect that things that I say today are new to many of you, but I hope I can present some new connections. bringing together aspects of communication during the COVID emergency that may not have occurred to you quite this order before. And I hope at the end, I'll be able to present some thoughts about how we all move forward from this moment. So let's start. So, as you heard, I'm a writer and I'm a teacher of writing, and in both of those books, I spend a lot of time, probably too much time, thinking about the shapes of stories and about how recognizing a narrative arc can tell us where we are in the progress. I bring this up because I think that our experience as journalists, profession, with the challenge of telling people about COVID over the past few years, maps surprisingly tightly to one of the classic narrative arcs, which is this one. This is the arc for the narrative structure of beginning life or entering a story in a good condition, encountering a problem that knocks you off course, falling into disarray, having to fight your way back out of it, to an eventual happy ending, to a point where if you look at this drawing closely, you actually end up slightly higher up the axis than where you started. This drawing was actually made by the novelist Kurt Vonnegut, who was kind of an obsessive about the shapes of stories. They were the subject of his master's thesis at the University of Chicago, which the University of Chicago declined to accept. And thus he went on to be a novelist. He described his thoughts about story shapes in a late-in-life memoir that he called A Man Without a Country. And Vonnegut called this pattern, the man in the hole, actually his writing, the classic map of someone encountering a difficulty, being knocked off course because of that difficulty and having to claw their way back to their prior condition. And I think that's a pretty good description of where we all were at the start of the pandemic, the past couple of years, before the past couple of years. And I think that what we all want to think at this point is that we are back at the end of the curve again. But as a profession, as news media practitioners, I don't think we're at that far end just yet. I think we are. I think we're here. At the point where we have been knocked askew, and we have not yet quite figured out how to climb our way back up the curve. The curve is not just the traumatic experience of COVID, which, let us make no mistake, was in fact a true trauma, a generational trauma that we will have to deal with at some point, and I think we have not quite yet. But the curve is also the profound communication challenge, made worse by the things that we take for granted now as sort of the water in which we swim, which is social media. COVID was the first fully online public health emergency that was a social epidemic. And as a result, it was the first public health emergency which people whose authority we take for granted, governments, federal agencies, academic researchers, career-long experts, were challenged in the public sphere to the degree they were by armchair experts, folks in their mom's basement, hostile actors from other countries, and also people who had an equivalent amount of authority to the known experts, but simply disagreed with what was going on. And I don't think as a society we did an adequate job of managing that challenge of public, let's call it discourse. And as I said, I don't think we quite pulled our way out of it. So let's dive into the COVID. I want to start actually with the last time that the United States and the world faced an epidemic caused by a coronavirus. And for those of you in the room who are undergraduates or online, I apologize about something that occurred before. But I promise I'll come up to it. So much of the public health world is united by reading a low-tech, text-only Web 1.0 listserv called ProMed that at this point has been going for more than 20 years. I hear ProMed fans in the audience, thank you. What ProMed represents is an early and ongoing, successful attempt at open source intelligence for disease outbreaks, carried out by means of listserv and emails to the moderator. It doesn't even have a comment section. And on February 10th, 2000, ProMed carried a question, and this is going to show you how open source intelligence. The question came from a Navy physician who was relaying a question sent to him by a former next door neighbor at a neighborhood outside a Navy base in Hawaii. At the time he sent this, he was actually living in Maryland. She was relaying news from a friend she had made, name she never knew, on a teacher's chat room. The person on the other side of the conversation was in Guangdong province, China. And this is, as you can see, this is what it says. Have you heard of an epidemic in Guangzhou? An acquaintance of mine, this is the teacher, an acquaintance of mine from a teacher's chat room lives there and reports that the hospitals there have closed and people are dying. So that question represented the first public notice outside China of the epidemic that came to be known as SARS, which went on to sweep the world, causing more than 8,000 known cases, 774 deaths, before public health action shut it down in July. So about March, April, May, June, July, 6 known months. Though the problem was that it had been going on in mainland China for a while before China confessed to it. And it was this, the reaction to this public health notice, that made the government of China fess up the fact that something was going on. Less than 24 hours later, the provincial government of Guangdong released a statement acknowledging that it had been raging for more than a month at that point. After the epidemic was shut down in July worldwide, the lack of transparency that this represented led to a permanent change in the World Health Organization's international health regulations, which are the rules that every government that belongs to the WHO, the World Health Assembly, agree to in order to conduct global public health. So that's what social media of its time did in 2003, in the pre-iPhone, pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter world, also pre. Information was disseminated, for the most part welcomed it, they collaborated to make use of it, and now we come to the second international epidemic of a coronavirus. As with SARS, ProMed was the first to alert the world to the existence of COVID. I'm afraid we have a slide for what happens next, because ProMed has recently had some little internal dissension, and they have shut down their archives past more than 30 days. So it's impossible to retrieve the notice that I'm going to describe to you, which was published in the last minute, 7:59 p.m. of December 29th, 2019. It was a post that translated and highlighted 2 online articles in Chinese language media describing official notices of viral pneumonia. Both those articles identified a possible link between patients and a local market that was selling live food and wildlife. And one of them drew an explicit connection between what was going on in Wuhan in these notices and what happened with SARS more than 20 years. Sorry, not quite 20 years at that point. So it was reasonable to hope that the international reaction to SARS almost 20 years earlier at that point would be repeated as well. That the lessons of SARS learned, that transparency and open communication would be honored, and that governments and civil society would work together to shut down the threat. But of course, the online world has very different. Almost 20 years. When SARS occurred, there was no Twitter, no public Facebook existed at Harvard. Those days, public Facebook and Twitter debuted in 2006. The first iPhone went on sale in 2007. You were pretty much in the world of Web 1.0 in 2000. One-way text-based communication. In the last days of 2019, when the first news of Twitter broke open to the world, Twitter, this internet times now known as X, had 300. And one of them, a public health researcher and epidemiologist with a Harvard connection named Eric Feigl-Ding, tweeted this: "Holy Mother of God. The coronavirus is a 3.8. He's talking there about the reproductive number of how many cases are caused by a single. How bad is that reproductive value? It's thermonuclear pandemic level bad. So that tweet and an explanatory thread that he wrote later that night of about 10 tweets, I think, have both been deleted from Twitter, but they survive in the Internet Archive, and that's where our copy from the address now. They're very well known among infectious disease people, because so many of them disagreed not so much with harm at this development, but with the apocalyptic way that he expressed it, a way that did not align with how public health portrayed itself as measured and thoughtful and not apocalyptic. To me, watching this, because I was intensely interested in it's a perfect example of what the journalist Alexis Madrigal, who works at The Atlantic and also was one of the founders of the civilian nonprofit volunteer COVID tracking product, COVID tracking project, which was a product that he and others created because they felt that the official public health system is not doing a sufficiently good job of counting COVID. Alexis wrote in The Atlantic just a couple of days after Vital Things. And this is, to me, is so prophetic. The most extreme statements on the internet, he's saying, can be far more amplified than more measured messages. While public health researchers are best to distribute scientific evidence, viral Twitter threads, context-free videos, and even conspiracy theories are reaching far more. And more than 3 years later, this remains what we have faced over the past couple of years. What we have to consider as communicators and public health people as we operate in social media. Because as anyone who operates online can tell you, mis and disinformation are not gay. So there's an ancient saying about a lie running around the world before the truth puts its tongue. And because I'm trying to be good at citations, I went looking for the original source of that, and it turns out that no one is actually sure who said it, except possibly that it originates in the poetry of Virgil, but Virgil probably wasn't wearing boots. Somehow this has become conflated, but probably the best original statement of this problem was written by Jonathan Swift, 17. Will lie be believed for only an hour? It has done its work. Falsehood flies and truth comes limping after. So that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late. Rumors and propaganda go viral, sober reporting does not. In a piece of work published actually before, in Science, before the COVID pandemic began, these researchers found that on Twitter, the top 1% of fake news, I should say false news, with something in echo, false news, cascades to between 1,000 and 100,000 people, whereas a true statement rarely diffuses to more than 1,000. False news faster than truth. So that's depressing. But in 2019 and 2020, we probably should have expected, because at the start of COVID, we were just emerging from a political regime that was overseen by someone who rejoiced in aggressiveness, sought virality, and had an uneven relationship to the truth. And that, of course, is former President Donald Trump. Before he was a presidential candidate, let alone president, Trump used social media pretty expertly, understanding the benefits of the medium to harangue the administration of then President Barack Obama. Of the many, many things he disagreed with the administration on, and several of those had to do with health and science, included the administration's handling of American involvement in the 2014 Ebola epidemic. in several months in 2014, NBC News did an analysis of this a few months afterwards. Trump published more than 100 posts about Ebola, the administration's response to Ebola, and the status of Americans who had gone to the Ebola zone to help out. He seems to have been particularly enraged by the health status of several Americans who'd gone to the Ebola area, become infected there, and were coming back to the US for treatment. Try that slide. Yes. Okay. So in one case, he insisted that physician Kent Brantley, who had contracted Ebola in Liberia as a medical missionary, he barred from re-entering the United States. And he also viciously attacked physician Fred Spencer, that's the second tweet, who had volunteered to go over, come back to the US, and discovered he was infected after he landed back in New York City. And of course, promptly reported himself to health authorities. So you can see what the engagement in these posts were, right? I re-downloaded these just this morning to make sure that the numbers were updated. So for the first, for people who can't see it on camera, more than 5,000 retweets, we call them then, 3,228 quote tweets, 2,700 likes below. For the second one about Craig Spencer, almost 6,200 retweets, more than 5,000 quote tweets for posts that got a lot of attention. So I don't know if anyone knows whether Trump is a strategic Twitter user or an instinctual one, but one way or another, he was very good at it. He managed to understand how to leverage the characteristics that researchers have shown drive engagement on social media: emotion and moralistic judgment. And the lesson, I think, going into the, and it could not have been more clear, against sober, careful, measured scientific communication, pithy, inaccurate virality win everything. So then we come to COVID. And I think this is a good time to define my terms, because I have not done it yet. That the challenges we faced through COVID and continue to face group themselves into two connected refs. There's misinformation, and then there's disinformation. So I'll define them this way. Misinformation is something incorrect that is offered honestly or with an intention to help. Disinformation is information that's incorrect or biased, that's offered with political or strategic or malicious intent. So misinformation is your auntie dropping something incorrect about vaccines in family group chats. And disinformation is when similar data offered create a malicious effect. And let's be clear, there were such malicious political effects. Several pieces of research done over the first year of COVID, excuse me, first 2 years, both of these come from 2021, showed that the proliferation of incorrect claims on social media could be traced back to foreign governments attempting to destabilize US public health and US civil society. So I don't want to be naive or dismissive about that problem, because it obviously was substantial. But I think we have to account for how many influences operating in the shared public space there were, other than just foreign propaganda. So let's go through a few of them. To start with, there's a well-recognized problem that none of us come naive to the experience of social media. We all arrive with our own predetermined beliefs about which sources of information are accurate. We engage with content, share it based on those beliefs, and without ever noticing we're doing it, we work pretty hard to avoid the discomfort of experiencing cognitive dissonance when our beliefs are challenged. Then there's the associated problem, which is the perceived dawn of the civilian internet, that on the platforms where we share information, expertise is flat. So I was tempted to put here a very famous New Yorker cartoon, which dates back to 1993, of two dogs sitting at a computer and talking to each other, and one dog says to the other, "On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog." But first, again, it was published long before many of people in this room were born, and second, I could figure out how to safely share it and respect the rights. So I'm being good about not being copyright trolled. let's look at this. On social media, an armchair epidemiologist can look just as credible as actual read one, possibly more credible if you judge people's veracity by their skill of phrasing, or the size of their follower count, or the size of the number of their retweets, which I think we are all vulnerable. And layered on top of those concerns is the reality that COVID was a new scientific problem, which meant that everyone on the internet got to watch science and policy being done in real time. Conversations, collaborations that would formerly have taken place over email, or in sidebar conversations of conferences, or debates within federal offices, were out in public, iteratively, step by step, for the world. And adding to that problem, the need to understand COVID led to an explosive use of preprint servers, sites where researchers place scientific papers that have not yet. Two outbreak scientists wrote, nope, next slide, please. Two epidemiologists and outbreak scientists wrote this just a few months into the pandemic, in October 2020, so 6 months after COVID had come to the United States. The demanding pace and large volume of COVID-19 science generated in the past months has made timely scientific communication through the conventional route of published biomedical journals, at best challenging, at worst obsolete. So I want to mention one final fact. More than 3 years into this, I think we've forgotten how fast everything started. That ProMed post alerting the world to COVID 1 minute before midnight on December 29th, so basically on New Year's Eve. By January 10th, researchers in Shanghai already had the complete genome of the virus sequenced and published publicly. 5 days after that, collaborators in Berlin, London, and the Netherlands posted the first proof of a laboratory diagnostic test. That is deep. And yet the virus was still racing ahead of us. Within 3 months from that first ProMed post, we passed the first billion cases worldwide. So, of course, the conversation is overwhelming. Just in March 2020, that's the point at which it made it to 1 million cases and also was recognized as a public health emergency in the United States. 550 billion tweets were sent just in that month mentioning COVID or coronavirus, as count was done by the Pan American Health. And in that same period, 361 billion videos mentioning COVID were uploaded to YouTube. So very quickly, the WHO, PAHO, Pan American Health Organization, other United Nations agencies, and academic researchers began warning that we faced what we call an infodemic. Combination of the overwhelming amount of new information being pushed onto social networks alongside misinformation, disinformation as well, and they were correct. We got assertions that, SARS-CoV-2 incorporated segments of HIV, or had emerged from snakes, or could be cured by sitting in a sauna or sticking a blow dryer down your throat. All of these were well engaged with on social media. None of them were true. It actually sort of the HIV insertion argument has been withdrawn from bioRxiv, thankfully. We got claims of vaccine injury. Next slide. Yep. Yes, that is Nicki Minaj saying that her cousin got the virus. Her cousin's friend, classic social media construction, got the vaccine against COVID, became impotent, his testicles were swollen, his marriage was canceled. There actually was a fascinating conversation depending from this in real time on Twitter, because Nicki Minaj subsequently went on to say that she herself was going to get vaccinated because it was the only way that she could tour. But she was encouraging her community not to take the authorities' word for granted, but rather to do their own research, to be sure that they felt comfortable with what they were doing and to have conversations among themselves. And several of her fandom praised her for that on social media, saying she is speaking to her people in a way that the authorities will never be able to penetrate, and we should not shout her down for doing so. We got, next one, pushing abundant numbers of unapproved and in some cases dangerous treatments. These are a variety of tweets pushing the drug ivermectin, the anti-parasitic drug, all of them coming from different points of view. The first is from an Indian subcontinental nationalist point of view, claiming that they use ivermectin and that's why they had such a low count of cases in India. The second is from a Republican congressional candidate. Third was from an MD who took a contrarian point of view throughout. The fourth is, who knows who this person is, but his online handle was COVID Crusher. Just to underline that this sort of stuff is not limited to the relative beginning of the pandemic. The flood abated. This tweet here in September, claiming vaccine, communicable vaccine contamination that was disrupting women's menstrual cycles. And let's you think, funny, we got 1 million, right? These are extremely powerful social media stuff. And we got to watch social media platforms attempt to push back greater or lesser degrees against this flood of mis and disinformation, some in good faith, some in not. We can't pretend that any of the platforms have been pure actors, any of this. They are all commercial businesses, and eventually we saw them, for a variety of motives, just give up. Twitter was at one time the platform that was doing the most to moderate political conversations. That is no longer. So now COVID cases are rising again. What can we say of this? But before the pandemic ever began, I think we understood that simply giving people information that we think they lack is not enough to change. That's known as the deficit model, science communication. And though it seems intuitive, show people where they were wrong, and they will change their minds. For more than a decade now, it has definitely been shown to be unsuccessful. Work by Dan Kahan identified the deficit model in the context of climate change. And more recent research shows that attempting to debunk people's false beliefs may actually harden people's attitudes rather than opening them to innovation, especially if they're exposed to attempts at debunking multiple times. So the deficit model is difficult to let go of because it hinges on practices that we've already learned as scientists or as journalists. We're all of us engaged in the pursuit of identifying knowledge and adding it to the knowledge we already have. That process makes intuitive sense to us. It just happens that we find it delightful because it's the way that we already work. It also just happens that as a communication technique, it's reliable. So what do we do instead? I think there are things that we can still ask the platforms to do, despite the fact that Twitter has abandoned the effort. We can ask for more curation. We can ask for slowing the promotion of information that looks obviously false. We can try to reinforce fact checking, which is a painstaking and expensive thing to do, and most of the platforms have outsourced that to volunteers, to academic centers. Some of the academic centers, as a result, have been called before Congress, so this is not a risk-free exercise, nor is it inexpensive. But I think as communicators, there are things that we need to take on ourselves, and that is that we should see tools of virality. Visuals, video, humor, authenticity, in one word, I think I'm arguing for storytelling. That can be first person. We see in some of the examples I've shown you how incredibly important the first person voice is. On some platforms such as TikTok, for instance, and even in Reddit, an old school text-based platform, first person, actually, I think in short form video in particular on TikTok, there's almost no getting away from using the person. So as journalists, I think we understand the power of storytelling and anecdote, even as we're taught to be suspicious of it, particularly in science writing, because we all know the role of anecdote, content data, that what N of 1 doesn't get us very far, but N of 1 is incredibly powerful for framing the message, a way of wrapping emotion and personal contact around the statistics and data that we need to deliver. And I think we should think about that more. This is hard because we feel naturally compelled, professionally compelled to be accurate, and to stray into techniques of storytelling feels like we are risking accuracy in favor of emotion. But I think we should confront from the experience of COVID that simply reciting the data is never going to get us from. I'm going to end this by wrapping back to the Eric Feigl-Ding slide that I showed you at the beginning. Oops. I'm sorry, let me show you this first. You can go back on. Yeah, great. So this is an interview that Renee DiResta, Stanford Internet Observatory, sorry I forgot to mention this, gave to UNICEF actually early in the pandemic, because UNICEF was very involved in the attempt to define the concept of infodemic and specifically to push out resources to journalists around the world. I think her remarks are still, which are in effect criticism of science, are still very a positive today. The scientific communication traditionally relies on presenting statistics and facts. I'm speaking precisely because accuracy is paramount. It's a very top-down approach to communication. The challenge for public health is to how to update communication style, communicate authentically, transparently while retaining accuracy. Okay, so now I'll go to that next slide, which is that I want to reevaluate Eric Feigl-Ding, who was so, who most of the public health internet found so disturbing, January 2020. So he was in fact wrong about the reproductive number. The reproductive number of COVID is not 3.8, fortunately for the world. I've never interviewed him. I don't know whether his phrasing at the time was spontaneous or strategic. I suspect it was spontaneous, and that's why he subsequently deleted this. But the fact that myself and many other health journalists and infectious disease people still remember your tweet says something about the communication style that it used, and not particularly that it was outrageous. Out of millions and millions and millions of tweets that have been sent about COVID over the years, that this was stuck. Maybe that shows that communicating somewhat apocalyptic, out of authentic emotion, out of shock, with an attempt to engage people's emotions, to engage people personally, maybe that's not such a mistake after all. Maybe there's a lesson in that. So I want to return to this question that I raised at the start of whether we, the journalism community, can locate ourselves in the narrative arc of the COVID. This is the path of the hero's journey that Vonnegut drew ought to be familiar, because whether or not you've actually thought about stories having an XY axis, which is basically what this is, this line describes stories that are fundamental to our cultures. It's the story of David and Goliath in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. It's the story of Oliver Twist, Stephen Copperfield, 19th century novels of Charles Dickens. It's The Hobbit. It's The Return of the King. And it's the path of Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, and many, many others aside. They all matter. And what unites all of those stories, other than in Western Europe, as we see happen to men, I have some criticisms of that, is that the struggle is always of an individual against a threat. When it's described as the hero's journey, the hero is always singular. And I want to invite us to rethink that. My sense of our experience of communicating during COVID is that nothing that any one person can do is adequate to stem the tide of false information or to push good information back into us. So maybe we reframe that narrative arc. Maybe we rewrite the story so that what saves us from the monster, not one champion, maybe it's the whole village. Maybe if we collectively take on the responsibility of combating the monster of misinformation at every moment, in every encounter that we have, can collectively do that. I do not have these answers for this. I know there are communication theorists who think about this more deeply than I do. I am just a practitioner. And in addition, we're all experienced. But I want to believe that collective effort to assert evidence, to explain, to invite people to look beyond their fires, can make a difference. But I think we only get there by taking responsibility for this as a community and as a profession. And if we do over time, we may be fortunate enough to climb that curve again, to get to where Vonnegut tells us we're going to go, which is a better condition than where we started it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryn, for that excellent presentation of social media and COVID. We have about 10 minutes, so time for questions both from here at the UNC Husband School of Journalism and Media and also on the webinar. Before we do that, I just wanted to mention sponsors of this talk. There are 4 of them: the American Association for Advancement of Science, Kavli Foundation, the UNC Gillings School of Global Public Health, and of course our school here, the Husband School of Journalism and Media. So any questions from the audience here, please feel free to ask Maryn and jump in.
Seriously, nobody wants to nerd out on story shapes. I can draw so many of them. Go ahead.
Can you define the definition between misinformation and disinformation one more time?
Yeah, sure. So, and this is not just my my definition. I've paraphrased. This has been published in various places by UNICEF, by PAHO, by the U.S. Surgeon General. Briefly, misinformation is offered innocently, and disinformation is offered maliciously. Now, maliciously could mean for strategic effect, for political effect, for social chaos, as an aspect of propaganda. But the key thing is that misinformation enters the discourse because someone thinks that they are helpful. Disinformation enters the discourse largely because someone wants to cause havoc.
Well, I could ask a lot of questions. So, I want to talk a little bit about the epidemic of lack of trust, or the public's lack of trust in institutions, which you're coming at from the perspective in some ways journalism and public health, but it is broader than that. It's a public loss of trust in government, in its healthcare providers, teachers, in any institution. So can you maybe think aloud about this same paradigm, not just in your industry, but more broadly?
Maryn, would you repeat the question for
So the question, okay, sorry for those watching at home. The question is, how do we address a broader loss of trust that affects not just government pronouncements about disease or asking people to participate in vaccination campaigns, but is a sort of society-wide element? Is that a fair statement? So this is hard, and I am going to say again, I am a practitioner. One of the pieces of research that I mentioned in the talk that I didn't have a slide for is a piece of research into the effectiveness of false claims. And where it concludes is that if people are exposed to repeated rounds of assertion debunk, they not only become less friendly to the assertion of factual information, but they tend to lose trust in the accuracy of information generally, that it puts them into a space of sort of cloud of unknowing. So I guess as somebody who's down in the weeds education, I'm just going to kind of go for that. I think what the when we attempt to make authentic connections, leading with personal information, emotion, with a sense that we are attempting to establish a shared community of education. I'd like to think that we can penetrate that bond of trust. Problem, I'm sure you can instantly see, is that this is incredibly labor intensive, right? And it's a long process. As we were talking before the talk began, as we were chatting before the talk began, mention was made that the best way to move forward public health campaigns in minoritized communities that have been moved mainstream for a variety of reasons is to have an established relationship with them, bringing that solution. And I think that's an incredibly important insight, that it is the experience of, sorry to sound like a Hallmark card, but the experience of shared humanity. I'm mocking myself as making these noises. That is, it doesn't solve it, but I think it begins how you operationalize that. Anybody else have? Yeah.
My question is more about like not really necessarily like something from the slide, but like how have you how would you address someone that has pushed misinformation that thinks that, oh, it's my First Amendment right, like I have a right to speak, like
Yeah. Let me tell an anecdote from my own life. It's actually really so. My last book about essentially the rise of industrial scale animal farming, how antibiotics are possible, and as a result, I'm very interested in food production, and I am a fool for noticing people doing something with animals anywhere it's happening. So I spend part of my time in very central Maine, and we were clearing out my deceased father-in-law's house. The guy came with a trailer to help us by carrying some. And he walked up wearing a GADS flag shirt and a hat, a "Don't Tread on Me" hat, that things that indicated that he was probably not occupying the exact same social space that I do. And as we were loading the trailer, he was very civil. It's a very, very nice conversation. As we were loading the trailer, he said he had to be done soon because someone was coming over to his barn to buy a pig for a pig roast. And my husband, big man, said, "Well, you know, my wife knows a lot about pigs." And yeah, she just wrote a whole thing about pigs and animals and antibiotics. And the guy instantly said, "Oh, I would never do that to you. I would never give that stuff to them. My pigs are all natural." He didn't say organic. "My pigs are all natural. They were born and bred on my property. I only sell people healthy." So first I was very rude for the people who were buying the pig from him for their pig roast. But then it occurred to me, here is someone who from all visual indicators, I would have profound, and yet we sort of around the back end, we had a point of not just connection, but agreement. There was a thing that we agreed about, which was local food systems, that we have used those words, and how we ensure safe and healthy. And I keep this guy in mind. I've never seen him again. We moved to one town over, which in central Maine is in another state. Because that encounter with him reminds me, there's almost always going to be a point of connection somewhere. I want to hope. That may not always be the case, but I think if we try and look for that, it might be. Anybody else? Questions from online?
Yes, there's I'll read you the question. As you note, heroes' journeys are the tale of one individual. One could argue those stories have shaped our desire to elevate specific people as heroes of either mis or disinformation, or as our saviors who will save us with their good information, like the discourse around Anthony Fauci. But the hero's journey is also a story that we as journalists often tell, often around COVID itself, reinforcing this bias. How does journalism work as a village? What do village journey stories look like?
Well, that was a smart conversation. Webinar participant, whoever you are, a smart comment, sorry. So again, I'll answer this analogically. As a journalist, especially being someone who until recently specialized in academic disasters, I have spent a good portion of my life parachuting to which I had no prior relationship, no knowledge, sometimes the language, pick up languages pretty quickly, so that's not a barrier, but that's not really important right now. What I came to learn over years and years and years of parachuting into places, how important it is that to start your exploration by encountering, rather than by randomly picking somebody out of, let's say, a refugee camp and asking them questions right away, which is kind of intrusive, of talking to the kids, getting to know a woman doing laundry, seeing if you can get invited back to a family's tent for a meal, and then engaging in conversation about what concerns them, before we get to what I'm here to ask. So we can't always do that. It's an enormous investment of time, and it requires a lot of indulgence on the part of the editors. But I am trying to respond to this question by saying that I just think we have to keep keeping community in mind. I want to look over here, but in fact, she's probably very and not assuming either that our needs have primacy, or that anyone's point of view does, not necessarily an argumentarianism, but rather that it's important that we remember that everything we do, every action we take, including as in our professionals community, our professional cohort, is an action that ought to be surrounded by or located in. And I think that pushes back against the allure of the hero's journey, which everything and coincidentally.
We have time for one more question from the web. Are there any recent examples of journalism pieces you admired that have effectively framed science and the public's interactions with it from this community-centric perspective? And that mirrors another question, which was, provide, if you would, a specific example of this kind of communication that is told through a storytelling lens. Both pretty much the same question.
So, as I think happens to other people, when people ask me questions like that about what is your life, but I'll offer this. I enormously value the work of the journalist Amy Maxman, who also she's been off doing a fellowship, foreign relations fellowship, for the past year with the Council on Foreign Relations. But before that, she was a staff writer for Nature, and she spent as much time as she could, and as much and as she could get grant money for going to Sub-Saharan and spending time in advance, getting to know, seeing what concerns communities had, and specifically articulating what their scientific concerns were, which were not necessarily what donors, health agencies thought. So, for instance, making sure that local that vaccine patents be held the developing world, making sure that vaccine manufacturing be held in the developing world, making sure that genomic sequencing could be established in sub-Saharan Africa. All of these are things that would not necessarily have sounded sexy to an agency sending or a publication sending her in the United States, but they were crucial to her source's understanding of their own situation. And at the time, Amy was working with Nature, and I give enormous credit to Nature that they published because they were fantastic stories, not as well read probably as they should have been. And to me, they represent a different method for tackling stories that we all want.
Well, thank you very much, Maryn. I should say Maryn McKenna, for joining us today, and I hope you've enjoyed and learned a lot from her study and reporting on this and disinformation about COVID. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.